In October of 1927, 9 men left Namche Bazaar for the upper Khumbu Glacier to recover the bodies of a lost climbing party. And of those 9, I am the only one who came back down. When I arrived at the British consul's office in Kathmandu 26 days later, I was carrying a metal case that no one on our team had packed, containing documents and personal effects belonging to men who had been dead for 13 months. The case had not been found at the altitude where those men died, but 4,000 feet below, placed on a trail cairn, as though someone had been trying to hand it to the next person who walked past. My name is Thomas Calder. I am 81 years old. I spent 32 years as a government surveyor in the Ordnance Survey of India and its successors, and I have not spoken a full account of what happened on that glacier to any living person in 54 years. Not because I was afraid of what I saw, but because I could not tell the truth about the creature without also telling the truth about the men who brought me there. And for a long time, I believed I owed those men a silence they did not earn. In my breast pocket right now, as I sit across this table from you, is a gold locket containing a photograph of a woman named Eleanor Beaumont, who died in Surrey in 1934, without ever learning what happened to her husband on the Khumbu Glacier, and without ever knowing that the locket she had placed in his expedition case was carried 4,000 feet down a mountain by a hand that was not human and delivered to a stranger on a ridge at sunset, while that stranger's companion hung in the air beside it. I have carried this locket for 54 years. I was supposed to bring it to her. I could not bring it to her without explaining how I received it. And I could not explain how I received it without telling this story. And I was not ready to tell this story until you walked through my door and asked about your grandfather. By the autumn of 1927, I had spent 11 years working survey lines across the Indian subcontinent, from the salt flats of Rajasthan to the cedar forests of the Kashmir Valley. And in those 11 years, I had learned to trust 3 things without qualification: my theodolite, which I maintained myself, and which had never once given me a false reading; the testimony of local guides, who knew the ground beneath their feet the way a surgeon knows the body beneath his hands; and the plain evidence of measurement, which does not lie and does not need to be believed in order to be true. I had also learned not to trust 3 things: the promises of expedition leaders who have never carried their own equipment, the confidence of men who dismiss what they have not personally witnessed, and the official record of any incident in which the reputation of a funding body is at stake. I am not a man who frightens easily. I have been charged by a bull elephant in the Terai, pinned beneath a rock slide on the Rotang Pass for 9 hours, and I once spent 4 days alone in a survey hut above the Zoji La with a broken ankle and no expectation of rescue. I tell you this not to boast, but to establish that when I describe what I saw on the Khumbu Glacier in the last week of October 1927, I am describing what I saw, measured where I could, estimated where I could not, and confirmed against every other surviving witness available to me. I was 27 years old at the time and stationed in Darjeeling, where the Survey of India maintained a seasonal office for the mapping of the Nepal-Tibet frontier approaches. I had requested the posting because the high survey work paid a supplementary wage, and because I wanted to see the mountains I had been drawing on other men's maps for 6 years. I was fit. I was experienced at altitude. I had worked at 16,000 feet on the Ladakh surveys the previous summer, and I was, critically, available. That last quality is the one that mattered, though I did not understand why until much later. On the morning of September 29th, I received a note at my lodgings from a man I had not met, requesting my presence at the Planters Club that afternoon to discuss, as the note put it, a recovery expedition of some urgency requiring survey capability. The note was signed by one Geoffrey Maitland, and it bore the stamp of the Royal Dorian Society, which I understood to be a London-based geographical and zoological club of moderate reputation. I attended because the note promised a fee of £40 above the survey's standard expedition rate, which was more than I earned in 2 months. I tell you about the money because it is relevant. I was not recruited for my principles. I was recruited because I could be bought cheaply and because I could use a theodolite at altitude. And if I'm honest about everything else in this account, I must be honest about that as well. At the Planters Club, I met the two men who would, over the next 4 weeks, dismantle every assumption I carried onto that glacier. The first was Jeffrey Maitland, age 39, born in Berkshire, educated at Sandhurst, and then, by his own account, privately a man of athletic build and excellent manners, who described himself as the Royal Dorian Society's field representative, a title I later learned he had invented for himself. The second was Dr. Alastair Hargrove, age 51, born in Edinburgh, a physician and naturalist who had served as medical officer on 2 prior Himalayan expeditions, and who carried himself with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being the most knowledgeable person in any room. Hargrove's hands were steady, and his questions were precise, and I liked him immediately, which is a fact I must also be honest about because it made what came later more difficult to bear. They told me the following. In the summer of 1926, an expedition of 6 men, led by Major Arthur Beaumont, had attempted a survey and climbing route on the upper Khumbu Glacier, approaching from the south. The expedition had lost contact in late August. A search the following spring had located evidence of a high camp at approximately 19,000 feet and had recovered personal effects, but no bodies. The 1927 expedition, our expedition, was to ascend the same route, locate and recover the remains of Beaumont and his 2 companions believed dead at a high altitude, and return them to Kathmandu for repatriation. The fee was generous because the work was unpleasant and the altitude was severe. I accepted the same afternoon. I will not describe in full what I now understand about that conversation, because I did not understand it then, and I want you to hear this story the way I lived it in order, with each lie still wearing the face it wore when it was told to me. On the morning of October 3rd, the full expedition assembled in the courtyard of the Dorian Society's rented house in Namche Bazaar, and I saw for the first time the men I would walk with into the ice. There were 9 of us in total, and because every one of them deserves to be named before I tell you what happened to them, I will name them now. Jeffrey Maitland, age 39, field representative, led the expedition on paper and carried a Mannlicher Schonauer carbine in a leather scabbard that he cleaned every night regardless of whether it had been fired, which it never was until the day it should not have been. Dr. Alastair Hargrove, age 51, Edinburgh, served as medical officer and naturalist and carried, in addition to his medical kit, a second equipment case made of reinforced leather and brass that was not on the expedition manifest, and that he described to me as supplementary medical supplies for high-altitude work. I noted this because I was the surveyor, and I had weighed and logged every piece of equipment, and this case was not on my list. It weighed approximately 40 pounds. Hargrove carried it himself and did not ask for a porter. Ang Dawa Sherpa, age 44, born in Tame Village approximately 12 miles west of Namche, served as mail runner and assistant sirdar, and had worked the trails between Namche and the upper Khumbu for 22 years, during which time he had, by his own accounting, crossed the glacier on foot more than 140 times. He was a quiet man with a square, wind-darkened face and a leather notebook he carried in his left breast pocket, and he wrote in it every evening with a pencil stub he kept behind his ear. I noticed the notebook the first day. I did not ask what was in it. That is one of the things I have thought about for 54 years. Pemba Tsering Sherpa, age 36, of Namche, served as head porter and had carried loads to 18,000 feet on 2 previous expeditions. Mingma Dorje Sherpa, age 19, of Tame, served as junior porter and cook's assistant. He was Ang Dawa's nephew, thin and quick and constantly watching everything with an alertness that I initially mistook for nervousness and later understood to be the careful attention of a young man who had been told to watch and learn. Pasang Norbu Sherpa, age 41, of Namche, served as cook and had an enormous calm about him that steadied every camp he occupied. Tenzing Wangchuk Sherpa, age 28, of Khumbu, served as porter and route finder and moved on the ice with a precision I have not seen equaled in 50 years of mountain work. Lieutenant James Arden, age 32, of Shropshire, seconded from the Indian Army's survey section, served as assistant surveyor and was, in my professional judgment, a competent and careful man who should not have died on that glacier and who would not have died if he had been told the truth about why he was there. 9 men. I have said their names. I will not say all of them again. On the morning of October 4th, we departed Namche Bazaar under clear skies, with approximately 800 pounds of equipment distributed among 6 porter loads, 2 personal packs, and Hargrove's unmanifested case. The trail north toward the glacier was well established. Ang Dawa had walked it, by his estimate, more times than he could count with confidence, and the first 2 days of the march passed in the ordinary rhythm of a well-organized Himalayan approach. Early starts, steady climbing through rhododendron forest, and then above the tree line into the moraine fields. Camps established by mid-afternoon to allow for altitude adjustment. Hot meals prepared by Pasang Norbu with a competence that bordered on artistry. I want to be clear about this. The expedition was well run. Maitland was an efficient organizer. Hargrove was attentive to every man's condition. And the Sherpa team worked with a fluid coordination that made the British members look clumsy by comparison. There was no friction, no illness, no sign of the disorder that sometimes overtakes a mixed party at altitude. The weather held. The loads were manageable. The route was sound. By the evening of October 5th, we had established our base camp at approximately 15,800 feet on the lateral moraine of the Khumbu Glacier, in a sheltered depression between 2 ridges of glacial debris that blocked the worst of the wind. I took a theodolite reading and confirmed our position against the Survey of India quarter-inch sheet. We were where we were supposed to be. The glacier stretched north and east above us, a broken highway of white and blue-gray ice that climbed toward the great peaks in a series of steps and shelves and pressure ridges that I could see, even from base camp, would require careful route finding. On the evening of October 5th, over tea, I asked Ang Dawa a question that had been sitting in my mind since Namche. The 1926 Beaumont expedition had filed a planned route with the consul's office that followed the western margin of the glacier, the standard approach. But the evidence recovered by the spring search party suggested that Beaumont had deviated sharply to the east, into a section of the icefall that was steeper, more crevassed, and farther from any previously surveyed line. I asked Ang Dawa whether he knew why Beaumont had changed his route. Ang Dawa looked at me for what I estimated to be 4 or 5 seconds longer than the question warranted. Then he said, "Major Beaumont was told something at the upper camp. I do not know who told him or what." He returned to his tea. I did not press. I should have pressed. On the morning of October 7th, 3 days above base camp, we were moving in single file through a corridor of ice seracs at approximately 16,500 feet when I heard a sound that stopped me on the trail. It was a striking sound, rhythmic, deliberate, repeating at intervals of approximately 4 to 5 seconds, and it came from above us and to the east, from somewhere inside the icefall that I could not see. The sound was sharp, like metal on stone, and it carried cleanly through the cold air in a way that made distance difficult to judge. I estimated the source at between 300 and 800 yards, though the ice walls around us created echoes that could have distorted my reading significantly. The sound repeated 9 times. I counted. Then it stopped. Arden, who was behind me on the rope, heard it as well. He said, "Rockfall." I said I did not think so. Rockfall in an icefall does not repeat at regular intervals. Rockfall does not stop cleanly. Pemba Tsering, who was leading, had also stopped, and he was looking not toward the sound, but at Ang Dawa, who was standing motionless with his head slightly tilted, the way a man listens when he is confirming something he has heard before. Hargrove, when he reached our position, offered an explanation without being asked. Thermal expansion, he said, ice fracturing along stress lines as the morning sun hit the eastern face of the icefall, producing percussive reports that could sound rhythmic at distance due to the uniform structure of the ice. It was a reasonable explanation. Arden accepted it. I noted it. The sound did not recur that day. At approximately 16,000 feet, on a flat section of moraine where the trail passed a series of stone cairns that Ang Dawa identified as traditional route markers maintained by Sherpa traders for at least 100 years, I observed Ang Dawa stop at one of the cairns, kneel, and run his fingers along a horizontal scrape on the top stone. The scrape was approximately 14 inches long, straight, and had removed the weathered surface of the stone to expose fresh gray rock beneath. It was, to my surveyor's eye, the mark left by a heavy, hard-edged rectangular object being set down, and then lifted again, the kind of mark a metal case leaves on a stone surface when it is placed and retrieved repeatedly over time. Ang Dawa examined 3 more cairns over the next quarter mile. Each bore a similar mark. He took out his notebook and wrote briefly, and when I asked what he had found, he said 5 words that I have replayed in my mind more times than I can responsibly estimate. Someone has been carrying something down. I asked him what he meant. He closed his notebook and put his pencil behind his ear and said nothing else. And I did not ask again because I recognized the quality of his silence. It was the silence of a man who has said exactly as much as he is prepared to say and will not be moved by further questioning. I had worked with men like Ang Dawa for 11 years, and I knew that silence was not evasion. It was precision. On the evening of October 7th, in camp at approximately 16,800 feet, I attempted to raise the subject with Maitland, describing the scrape marks and Ang Dawa's observation. Maitland listened politely and said that porters and traders had been using those cairns for generations, that any number of metal cooking vessels, equipment boxes, and supply tins had been set on those stones over the decades, and that reading a single narrative into random trail wear was the kind of thing that gets into expedition reports and embarrasses everyone involved. He was smiling when he said it. I noted his response and did not raise the subject again with him. That night, in my tent, I heard the striking sound again, fainter, farther away, higher on the glacier. 7 repetitions this time, at the same 4 to 5 second interval. Then silence. The wind was calm. The sky was clear. The temperature, by the thermometer I kept clipped to my pack, was approximately 12 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. I wrote in my survey log, percussive sound, rhythmic. Source estimated east to northeast, 7 reps, 21:45 hours. Not ice fracture interval too regular, cessation too clean. Source undetermined. I did not show this entry to Hargrove or Maitland. Arden, whose tent was next to mine, said the following morning that he had heard it as well. He said it sounded like someone trying to open a locked box on the morning of October 9th at approximately 17,500 feet. Tenzing Wangchuk found the case. He was scouting the route approximately 200 yards ahead of the main party when he stopped and raised his hand in the signal we had established for "come forward and look." When I reached his position, I saw what had stopped him. A metal case, approximately 20 inches long, 14 inches wide, and 8 inches deep, made of brass-cornered tin with leather straps and a hinged lid, sitting upright on a flat boulder beside the trail, as though someone had set it there and stepped away for a moment. The leather straps were broken, not cut, but stretched and snapped, as though something with great strength had tried to open the case by pulling the straps apart. The metal was dented along one edge and heavily scratched on every surface, the kind of damage consistent with being handled by something hard and rough over a long period. But the case was intact. The lid was still latched. Maitland, Hargrove, Arden, Ang Dawa, and I all examined the case before it was opened. I record this because it matters that 5 men saw it in situ, on the boulder, at 17,500 feet, before its contents were disturbed. The boulder itself was dry and wind-scoured, and the case had left a clear, rectangular impression in the thin frost on its surface, suggesting it had been placed there within the previous 12 to 24 hours, recent enough that the frost had formed around it, but not over it. Hargrove opened the case. Inside, wrapped in oilskin that was still partially intact, were the following items: a leather folio embossed with the initials ARB, Arthur Reginald Beaumont, containing expedition papers, route notes, and correspondence, a bundle of personal letters tied with string, a gold locket on a chain, containing a photographic portrait of a woman, and a sealed inner envelope of heavy waxed canvas marked in Beaumont's hand with the words, "For the Society Private." The documents were damp but largely legible. The locket was tarnished but undamaged. Everything had been packed carefully, the way a man packs what matters most to him. The team's reaction was immediate and practical. This was evidence of the Beaumont party, and its discovery 4,000 feet below the last known high camp was significant. Arden said, "Avalanche could have carried it." Maitland agreed. Hargrove said nothing for a moment, and then said, "The oilskin is largely intact, which suggests it was not tumbled through debris over 4,000 vertical feet." This was accurate. I had been thinking the same thing. An avalanche carries objects violently. It strips coverings, opens containers, scatters contents. This case was battered but organized. Its contents were arranged. It had been carried, not thrown. I looked at the ground around the boulder. The snow was patchy at this altitude, with exposed rock and moraine gravel. But in a soft section approximately 6 feet south of the boulder, I found a footprint. It was not a boot print. It was bare, or nearly bare, the impression of a foot without a sole, approximately 17 inches long by 8 inches wide, with 5 distinct toe impressions, of which the largest was, by my estimate, the size of a small plum. The depth of the print, in snow of the density I measured by pushing my ice axe handle into an adjacent patch, suggested a weight I calculated at the time as between 400 and 500 pounds, though I want to be clear that this was an estimate based on assumptions about the snow's compression rate, and I would not defend the specific figure under professional scrutiny. The print was fresh. The edges were sharp. It had been made within hours. Arden saw the print. Ang Dawa saw the print. Pemba Tsering, who had come forward, saw the print and said a single word in Sherpa that I did not understand at the time, and that Ang Dawa did not translate. Maitland saw the print and said, "Bear." Hargrove saw the print and said, "Possibly a bear. Yes, a large specimen standing on its hind legs, which they do when investigating objects with a strong scent. Leather, for instance." His voice was steady and his explanation was fluent, and it was, I now believe, entirely rehearsed. I measured the print with my survey tape. I recorded its dimensions in my log. I looked at Ang Dawa, who was looking at his notebook open now, to a page I could not read, and I said, "Is this what has been carrying something down?" Ang Dawa closed the notebook. He looked at me with an expression I can only describe as the face of a man who has been waiting to be asked a question and is not yet certain the questioner is ready for the answer. He said, "It has been coming to us." I asked him what he meant. He said, "This case. I have seen it before. 3 times, lower each time." He opened his notebook and showed me 3 entries, dated February, April, and July of 1927, each recording the location of a metal case matching this description at progressively lower elevations: 18,200 feet, 17,100 feet, and 16,400 feet. Trail cairns, each time placed upright, each time on a flat stone, each time with fresh tracks around it, tracks that were not human and not, in Ang Dawa's careful estimation, bear. 4 positions over 11 months, a descent of nearly 2,000 vertical feet, consistent placement on trail infrastructure maintained by humans, and now a 5th position at 17,500 feet, which was, I realized, with a precision that unsettled me. The highest elevation on the standard approach route where a man walking north from Namche Bazaar would certainly pass. The case had been brought down to the trail. It had been left where someone would find it. I have thought about this for 54 years, and I will not speculate here about what that implies, about the intelligence of the thing that carried it, because speculation is not what I owe this record. I owe it what I measured and what I saw, and what 3 other men confirmed with their own eyes. The case had moved. It had been placed. It had been brought down to us. Maitland, when I reported Ang Dawa's observations, said only, "Superstitious, but noted." He instructed Hargrove to take custody of the case and secure the sealed envelope. Hargrove did so immediately, placing the envelope inside his own unmanifested equipment case, which he then locked. The locket and the personal letters remained in the Beaumont case, which was assigned to my load. I did not object. I did not yet understand why the sealed envelope was separated from the rest. On the morning of October 11th, at first light, I was standing outside my tent at our Camp 3, approximately 18,200 feet, adjusting the eyepiece on my theodolite for a bearing I intended to take on the northeast ridge, when I saw movement on the glacier above us. The distance was, by my subsequent triangulation, approximately 410 yards. The figure was upright, bipedal, and standing motionless on a snow shelf below a line of serric towers that formed the lower lip of the upper ice fall. It was white, not the flat white of snow, but a textured, slightly yellowish white, like old wool or matted animal hair. And it was large. I am a surveyor. I do not estimate height without reference objects, and at that distance my reference was the serric tower behind the figure, which I had measured the previous afternoon at approximately 35 feet from base to crown. The figure stood at roughly 1/3 the height of the serac. I will say, with the qualification that this is a visual estimate made at 400 yards through cold, clear air without magnification, that the figure was between 11 and 14 feet tall. I will not narrow that range. The conditions did not permit it. The figure did not move for the duration of my observation, which I timed by counting my own breaths at a rate I had calibrated over years of survey work, approximately 1 breath every 4 seconds at that altitude. I counted approximately 280 breaths, roughly 19 minutes. It stood. It faced our camp. Its posture was not aggressive. I saw no bared teeth, no raised arms, no forward lean. It stood the way a man stands when he is watching something he's been watching for a long time and is in no hurry to stop. Ang Dawa was beside me within the first minute. He had been awake before me. He was always awake before everyone, and he had seen the figure before I had. He did not point. He did not speak. He stood beside me and watched with an expression I would describe as professional attention, the same expression I'd seen on experienced guides when they assessed a difficult route section or a changing weather pattern. He was not afraid. He was reading. Mingma Dorje, who had come out of the cook tent to relieve himself, saw the figure as well. He stopped approximately 10 feet from me, and I heard his breath catch, and he said something in Sherpa that I did not understand, but that Ang Dawa answered with a single low word. Mingma did not move for the remainder of the sighting. At approximately the 19-minute mark, the figure shifted its weight a lateral movement, smooth and unhurried, and walked to the left, behind the serric tower, and out of sight. Its gait was bipedal, upright, and covered what I estimated to be 30 to 35 feet in 4 strides. I recorded this in my survey log. 4 strides for 35 feet. Stride length of approximately 8 to 9 feet. I have never seen a bear walk upright for 35 feet. Maitland was awake by the time the figure disappeared. I reported what I had seen. He asked how far. I said 400 yards. He asked what it was. I said I did not know. He said, "A white bear, seen through ice haze at 400 yards, is going to look very strange indeed." I did not argue with him. Hargrove, who emerged shortly after, asked no questions at all. He looked toward the Sarek Tower where the figure had been, and he looked at Maitland. And something passed between them that was not spoken, but that I registered clearly, the brief, controlled expression of two men confirming to each other that a circumstance they had anticipated had arrived on schedule. I did not understand it then. I understand it now. On the evening of October 11th, after the team had spent the day ascending to the site of the Beaumont party's high camp, which we reached at approximately 19,100 feet, finding the remains of 2 tents, a cache of frozen equipment, and no bodies, Ang Dawa asked to speak with me privately. We walked approximately 50 yards from camp to a rock shelf overlooking the glacier, and there, with the temperature at approximately 18 degrees below zero, and the last light of the day turning the western peaks the color of an old bruise, Ang Dawa told me what he knew. He spoke for what I estimate was 7 or 8 minutes, without interruption, and I will reproduce what he said as faithfully as my memory and my notes permit, understanding that I am compressing a measured, careful statement delivered in accented but precise English by a man who chose every word with the deliberation of someone who has been composing this statement in his head for years. Mr. Calder, I have been walking between Namche Bazaar and the upper glacier for 22 years. In that time, I've delivered mail, I've carried supplies, I've escorted 12 expeditions to various camps on the lower and middle glacier, and I've walked alone through the icefall on perhaps 40 occasions, when the trail conditions were good and I judged the risk acceptable. I know this glacier. I know it the way you know your instruments, by feel, by repetition, by the accumulation of 1,000 small observations that together make a picture. I am telling you what I know, not what I believe, because what I believe is my own business, but what I know belongs to any man who walks where I have walked. There is something living in the upper icefall. I have seen it 4 times in 22 years, twice at distances I would judge to be 500 yards or more, once at perhaps 200 yards, and once in February of this year at a distance I measured by pacing afterward at 91 yards. Each time it was alone. Each time it was carrying something. The first time I could not see what it carried. The second and third times it carried what I believe was a large stone or piece of ice. The fourth time, the closest time, it was carrying the metal case that we found 2 days ago on the trail. I saw it set the case on a trail cairn. I watched it do this. It used both hands. It set the case down the way a man sets down a parcel he does not wish to break, carefully, with attention to the surface. Then it stood beside the cairn for perhaps 1 minute, looking down the trail, looking toward Namche, toward the lower villages, toward the direction from which men come. Then it walked back up into the icefall. I marked the cairn. I returned 3 days later. The case was gone. I found it again in April, 2 cairns lower. Again in July, lower still. Each time, the case had been carried down and placed on the trail. I do not know what this creature is. I am not a llama, and I am not a storyteller. I am a mail runner. I carry things from one place to another. And I know when I see another being doing the same work. This creature found something that does not belong on the glacier. It has been trying to bring it down. It does not know where to leave it. It has been looking for someone to give it to. Ang Dawa stopped speaking. He put his pencil behind his ear. He looked at me the way a man looks at another man when he has handed him something heavy and is waiting to see if he will carry it or set it down. I said, "Why did you come on this expedition?" He said, "Because I heard Dr. Hargrove's name." I asked what that meant. He said, "Dr. Hargrove was on the Beaumont expedition last year. He was at the lower camp. He did not go to the high camp. He came down 3 days before the others went up. I carried a message for him to Namche. The message was to a man in Darjeeling. The message said, "The route to the Eastern Cirque is confirmed. Bring the equipment in October." I did not sleep that night. I lay in my tent with my survey log on my chest, and I listened to the glacier creak and shift beneath me. And I thought about a creature that carries parcels down a mountain, and a physician who had been on the expedition he was now supposedly rescuing. And I thought about Maitland's rifle, and Hargrove's unmanifested case. And I understood not fully, not yet, but with the first cold clarity of a measurement that will not resolve to the number you wanted, that the expedition I was on was not the expedition I had been told I was on. On the afternoon of October 13th, we were descending the ridge between the Beaumont High Camp and our Camp 3, carrying the remains of 2 of the 3 Beaumont climbers on improvised pack frames, when the creature came down to meet us. I must describe the conditions precisely because what happened next lasted approximately 4 minutes, and I have found, in 54 years of returning to those 4 minutes in my mind, that the precision of the setting is what keeps the memory from becoming something I can dismiss. The time was approximately 1600 hours. The sun was 45 minutes from setting behind the western ridge of Nuptse, and the sky above the ridge was the deep amber orange that comes in the Himalaya when dust from the Tibetan plateau is carried south by the upper winds, not a sunset color, but a burning color, the color of heated metal. The temperature was approximately 6 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. A storm system that Ang Dawa had identified that morning by the lenticular cloud formations over Lhotse was building from the north, and the wind at our altitude had increased from negligible to what I estimated at 15 to 20 miles per hour, with gusts that staggered Mingma, who was the lightest man on the team. We were roped in 2 groups, Maitland, Arden, and Tenzing Wangchuk on the first rope, myself, Ang Dawa, Mingma, Pemba Tsering, and Pasang Norbu on the second. Hargrove walking unroped between the 2 groups, which I now understand was a deliberate positioning that allowed him to move freely. The ridge was approximately 6 feet wide at its narrowest, with a slope of roughly 40 degrees falling away on both sides to crevassed glacier below. We were moving slowly because the pack frames were awkward, and the wind was quartering across the ridge from the northeast, pushing the load sideways. Arden, who was carrying one of the bodies, had stopped twice to adjust his frame straps. We were spread across perhaps 120 yards of ridge, moving south toward Camp 3, which was approximately 400 vertical feet below us and 40 minutes away at our current pace. I was looking at my feet watching my crampon placement on a section of blue ice that had been polished by wind when Ang Dawa, who was directly in front of me, stopped. He did not speak. He did not signal. He simply stopped walking, and the quality of his stillness was so absolute that I stopped as well, and looked up and saw it. It was standing on the ridge above us, approximately 80 yards ahead of the first rope team, and it was holding the metal case. I must be clear. We had left the Beaumont case at Camp 3 that morning, secured inside a supply tent. The creature had descended to our camp while we were at the Beaumont High Camp, retrieved the case, and carried it up to meet us on the ridge. It had known where we would be and when we would be there. It had timed its approach to intersect our descent. I do not speculate about what this implies. I state what the evidence requires me to state. The creature was standing fully upright in profile against the amber sky, and at 80 yards, with the ridge as a horizontal reference, I could measure it with more confidence than my earlier sighting. I estimate its height at 12 to 14 feet. Its shoulders were, in proportion, approximately 4 feet across. Its fur, and it was fur, not hair, dense and matted and discolored by ice and wind to a yellowish white that caught the orange light and turned it to something I cannot adequately describe. Its fur covered its entire body except the face, which was dark, broad, and flat-featured, with a heavy brow ridge and eyes that caught the light. I will not describe the eyes in full because I have spent 54 years trying to find the right word, and I have not found it, and I will not offer an inadequate one. The eyes were open. They were directed at us. They were not the eyes of an animal. It held the case in its left hand against its hip, the way a man carries a suitcase. Its right hand was empty and open at its side. It was not crouching, not charging, not displaying. It was standing on the ridge in our path, holding a metal case that it had carried 4,000 feet down a glacier and then back up again to put in front of us. And it was waiting. Maitland saw it first among the lead rope. I heard him say something I could not make out the words over the wind, and then I saw him reach for the manlicher. Arden grabbed his arm. I could see them struggling. Tenzing Wangchuk had dropped to his knees on the ridge and was pressing his forehead to the ice. And he was speaking rapidly in a language I did not recognize. Not Sherpa, not Nepali, something older. Maitland freed his arm. He raised the carbine. The creature moved. I will not pretend I saw the movement clearly at 80 yards. In wind, with the light behind it. What I saw was a shift, a closing of distance that compressed 80 yards into what I can only describe as less time than I was prepared for. Maitland fired once. I heard the shot flatten against the wind. The creature reached Maitland and picked him up. It picked him up with one hand. It closed its right hand around Maitland's torso, around his chest and one arm, and it lifted him off the ridge the way a man lifts a child out of a wash basin. And it held him at arm's length, approximately 6 feet off the ground. And Maitland was screaming, and his legs were kicking, and the rifle was hanging from its strap. And the creature was not looking at Maitland. It was looking at us. It extended its left hand, the hand holding the case toward the group, toward me and Ang Dawa and Mingma and Pemba and Pasang, who were standing on the ridge in a line, roped together, unable to move, watching a man suspended in the air by something that should not exist and that was offering us a metal case with its other hand. There are parts of this I have never told anyone and will not tell here, because they concern the sounds Maitland was making and the angle of his body and the expression on the creature's face while it held him, and they are not sounds or angles or expressions I'm willing to put into any record that might be read by someone who was not there. I will tell you only what happened next. Ang Dawa unclipped from the rope. He walked forward. He walked past Arden, who was flattened against the ridge, and past Tenzing, who was still on his knees. And he walked directly toward the creature, with his hands open, and his palms up, and his pace steady. Not slow, not fast. The pace of a man walking a trail he has walked 1,000 times. He stopped approximately 10 feet from the creature. He reached up, and the creature lowered the case, and Ang Dawa took it with both hands. He stepped backward 3 paces. He set the case on the ridge. He looked up at the creature, and he said, and I heard this, over the wind. At a distance I estimated 60 yards, he said, "Thank you, we have it now." The creature set Maitland down. It did not drop him. It set him down on the ridge, on his feet, the way you set down something you have been holding and no longer need to hold. Maitland collapsed. The creature stood for a moment, 3 seconds, perhaps 5, and then it turned and looked at the pack frame on Arden's back, the one carrying the body of one of the Beaumont climbers. It looked at the pack frame for what I counted as approximately 8 seconds. Then it reached past Arden, who did not move, who I believe could not move, and it lifted the pack frame off his back, and it set the frame on the ridge, and it untied the body from the frame with movements that I can only describe as practiced, not fumbling, not tearing, but untying, the way a man who has handled rope unties a knot. It laid the body on the ridge. Then it reached behind the Sarek Tower where it had first appeared, and it brought out a second body and set it beside the first. The second body was not one of the 3 Beaumont climbers. It was a 4th man, a man who had not been on any roster, whose existence had not been mentioned in any briefing. whose body had been stored somewhere on the upper glacier by the creature and brought down to this ridge for this moment. The creature looked at us. It looked at the two bodies on the ridge. It looked at the case that Ang Dawa had set down. Then it turned and walked back up the ridge, into the icefall, into the orange light. And I watched it until I could not distinguish it from the ice, which took, by my count, approximately 90 seconds. Maitland was on his hands and knees, gasping. Arden had not moved. Tenzing was weeping. Mingma was gripping the rope with both hands and staring at the place where the creature had stood. Pemba and Pasang were behind me, pressed together, silent. Ang Dawa picked up the case. He looked at me. He said, "It is finished." It was not finished. On the ridge, in the last light, with the storm now visible as a dark wall advancing from the north, Hargrove knelt beside the fourth body and identified it immediately. He said, "That's Crowe." He said it the way a man says the name of someone he has been expecting, without surprise, without the hesitation of recognition, with the flat certainty of a man reading a label he already knew was there. Arden, who was sitting on the ridge with his arms around his knees and his face the color of ash, said, "Who is Crowe?" Hargrove did not answer. Maitland, who had stopped gasping and was now sitting with his back against a serac, his chest bruised and his right arm hanging at an angle I did not like, said, "Hargrove, don't." I looked at the fourth body. The man had been dead for approximately 13 months, preserved by the cold, his face darkened and drawn but recognizable as a man in his middle 40s, broad-shouldered, with a heavy jaw and hands that, even in death, were thick and calloused. He was wearing a canvas hunting jacket, not climbing gear. Beside him, and I did not notice this immediately because I was looking at the face, was a leather equipment roll, frozen stiff, that had been placed beside the body the way you place a man's belongings beside him at a funeral. I opened the roll. Inside were specimen jars, 6 of them, glass, with rubber stoppers, empty, each labeled with a printed tag that read, "Royal Dorian Society Zoological Collection Field Specimen," followed by a blank line for the species name. I said, "Who was Crowe?" Hargrove closed his eyes. The wind was picking up. The storm was perhaps 2 hours from our position. Maitland said again, "Hargrove." And Hargrove opened his eyes and looked at me and said, "James Crowe was the expedition's hunter. He was on the Beaumont party. He was not a climber. He was there to obtain a specimen." I asked, "A specimen of what?" Hargrove said, "Of exactly what you just saw. I will tell you what I understood in the next 30 seconds, because it came not as a single revelation, but as a sequence of small collapses, each one removing a support that I had not known was bearing weight. The Beaumont expedition of 1926 was not a climbing expedition. It was a collection expedition funded by the Royal Dorian Society, whose charter, I later confirmed this in London, included the acquisition of specimens of zoological interest from unexplored territories as one of its founding purposes. Major Beaumont had been hired to lead the logistics. Crowe had been hired to make the kill. Hargrove had been at the lower camp not as a medical officer, but as the naturalist responsible for preservation and transport of the specimen. When Crowe went up with the climbing party and did not come back, and when the other 3 died, I now believe because Crowe provoked the creature and it responded, Hargrove came down with the knowledge of what had happened and the understanding that the specimen was still on the glacier, alive. The 1927 expedition, our expedition, was the second attempt. Maitland was the Society's representative. Hargrove was the returning naturalist. The rescue mission was real in the sense that recovering the bodies was genuinely intended, but it was not the primary purpose. The primary purpose was to recover Crowe's equipment, map the creature's location, and prepare the route for a full collection party the following spring. I was recruited as a surveyor because the Society needed a route map drawn by a professional. Arden was recruited as a second surveyor for the same reason. We were the cartography for a hunt. I said to Hargrove, "You knew what was on this glacier." He said, "Yes." I said, "You knew what killed those men." He said, "Crowe killed those men." Crowe went up into its territory with a rifle and specimen jars, and he tried to take something that was not his to take, and 3 men died because they were between him and the consequence. I said, "And you brought us back." He said nothing. Maitland said nothing. The wind was now strong enough that I had to raise my voice, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that I associate with moments when the body understands something the mind is still processing, that I was standing on a ridge at 19,000 feet, arguing about moral responsibility with men who had used me as a tool, and that the storm would kill us all if we did not descend in the next hour, and that the creature which had just handed us a dead man's belongings and laid out a body it had been keeping for 13 months had behaved with more honesty in 4 minutes than these men had managed in 4 weeks. Ang Dawa, who had been standing with the case, said, "The creature gave back what was taken from it. The man with the jars was the trespass. The others were the cost. This is not complicated." He looked at Hargrove. He said, "You were not sent to rescue anyone." Hargrove looked at the specimen jars, at Crowe's body, at the empty glacier above. He said, "No." Ang Dawa said, "And you will not come back." It was not a question. It was the closing line of a transaction, delivered by a man who had spent 22 years learning the grammar of what lived above him, and who understood, with a certainty I have never achieved in 54 years of trying, that the creature had just completed its half of an exchange, and that the only remaining question was whether the humans would complete theirs. On the night of October 13th, the storm hit the upper Khumbu Glacier with a violence I have experienced only once in my life, and hope to never experience again. By the time we reached Camp 3, a descent of 400 vertical feet that took approximately 90 minutes in deteriorating conditions, the wind was gusting at what I estimated to be 60 to 70 miles per hour. The temperature had dropped to approximately 28 degrees below zero, and the visibility had closed to less than 30 feet. We had brought down one of the 2 Beaumont bodies. The other, and Crowe's body, we had been forced to leave on the ridge, secured under ice axes driven into the snow, a decision that Ang Dawa made without consulting Maitland, who was in no condition to be consulted. Maitland's right arm was broken at the elbow. I could feel the misalignment through his sleeve when I helped him into the tent. And Hargrove, who set the bone with professional efficiency that I found obscene under the circumstances, estimated a clean fracture of the olecranon. I will not repeat here the things Maitland said during the bone setting, because they were spoken in extremity, and because some of them were directed at Hargrove and concerned the expedition's true purpose in language that made clear Maitland had been a willing participant from the outset. Arden heard these statements. So did I. Neither of us responded. There was no time. On the morning of October 14th, the storm had not abated. Visibility was approximately 15 feet. The temperature inside the tent, with 4 men breathing, was approximately 12 degrees below zero. Ang Dawa, Mingma, Pemba, Pasang, and Tenzing were in the second tent. At approximately 0700 hours, Hargrove announced that he was going to ascend to the ridge to secure Crowe's body and equipment roll. I told him the conditions made this impossible. He said the specimen jars and Crowe's notes were essential to the Society's records, and that he had a professional obligation to recover them. I told him he had a professional obligation to keep himself alive. He dressed, took an ice axe, and left the tent without another word. I watched him walk into the whiteout heading north. I did not see him again. There is a part of this account I have decided not to tell. It concerns what I believe happened to Hargrove on the upper ridge, and it is not based on evidence, but on a single sound I heard approximately 2 hours after his departure. A sound carried on the wind that may have been a human voice and may have been ice fracture, and that I have been unable to classify in 54 years of listening to it in my memory. I will not speculate about it. Hargrove walked into the storm, and did not return. And whether the mountain took him, or the creature took him, or he took himself, is a question I cannot answer and will not pretend to answer. On the afternoon of October 14th, during a brief moderation in the wind, Maitland left the tent. His arm was splinted and bound, and he was carrying nothing. He said he was going to check on the supply cache at the east end of camp. He walked east. 20 minutes later, Arden went to find him and found his tracks leading not to the supply cache, but to the southern edge of a crevasse field we had marked with wands on our ascent. The tracks ended at the lip of a crevasse, approximately 8 feet wide, and by the depth of the darkness when Arden shone a torch into it, at least 200 feet deep. There were no marks on the lip consistent with a struggle or a slip. The snow was undisturbed except for the boot prints, which walked to the edge and stopped. I have thought about this for 54 years, and I will not tell you what I think it means, because I was not there when Maitland reached that edge, and I do not know what was in his mind. And every explanation I have constructed in half a century is a story I'm telling myself, not a fact I can report. By the morning of October 15th, the storm had reached its full intensity. The second tent, the one sheltering Ang Dawa, Mingma, Pemba, Pasang, and Tenzing, was torn from its anchors at approximately 0300 hours. The 5 men survived the collapse and sheltered behind a supply wall until dawn, but the tent and most of its contents were carried into the icefall by the wind. At first light, with no shelter for 5 men and insufficient supplies for the first group, Ang Dawa made the decision to descend. We went down in 2 groups, Arden, Pemba, Tenzing, and Pasang on the first rope, moving fast, carrying minimal loads. Myself, Ang Dawa, and Mingma on the second rope, moving slower, carrying the Beaumont case and the essential survey equipment. The storm was still fierce, but the wind had shifted to the west, which put it at our backs on the southern descent and made movement possible, if not safe. At approximately 16,000 feet on the moraine trail where Ang Dawa had found the first scrape marks 6 days earlier, the first rope team's tracks diverged from the trail. I do not know why. Ang Dawa studied the tracks and said they had turned east into a crevasse field, perhaps disoriented by the whiteout conditions that persisted at that altitude despite the wind shift. We followed for approximately 300 yards. The tracks entered a section of the glacier where the surface was fractured into blocks, and the visibility was less than 20 feet. Ang Dawa stopped. He said, "We cannot follow them in this." He was right. The terrain was lethal in those conditions. We called out. The wind took our voices. We waited 1 hour. No one came. Arden, Pemba, Tenzing, and Pasang were never found. The spring search party, organized by the consul's office at my insistence, located the remains of 1 man later identified as Pasang Norbu by his cooking kit at the bottom of a crevasse approximately 1 mile east of the trail. The other 3 are still on the glacier. Below 16,000 feet, the storm began to moderate. At approximately 14,000 feet, on the afternoon of October 15th, in a section of trail that was sheltered from the wind by a lateral moraine wall, Ang Dawa stopped walking. He set down his pack. He opened the Beaumont case, which I had been carrying, and he removed the expedition papers, the sealed folio, and his own notebook. He placed these items in his pack. Then he removed the gold locket and the bundle of personal letters and held them out to me. "This belongs to a woman in England," he said. "The letters are from her husband. The locket has her photograph. You will find her." I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "These papers belong to the mountain. I'm going to put them back." I said, "You cannot go back up in this storm." He said, "The storm is ending." I said, "Ang Dawa, please." He looked at me with an expression that I have never seen on another human face, and that I will not attempt to describe because I've learned in 54 years that some expressions are not for description, but for carrying, and this one has been heavy enough. He said, "Mr. Calder, the creature finished its work. You saw this. It carried that case for 11 months. It kept Crowe's body for 13 months. It brought them to us, and it set them down, and it asked for nothing except that we take what was ours and leave what was not. Hargrove's papers are not ours. The Society's instructions are not ours. What Crowe was sent to do is not ours. These things belong to the glacier, and I am going to return them. He shouldered his pack. Mingma, who had been standing silently, shouldered his own pack and stepped in behind his uncle. Ang Dawa looked at me once more. He said, "Carry the locket, find the woman. Tell her that her husband's things were looked after." They turned and walked north, back up the trail, into the thinning storm. I watched them until the trail curved behind a moraine ridge and they passed out of sight. I called Ang Dawa's name twice. He did not turn around. I descended alone. I carried the locket and the letters and my survey log and nothing else. I reached Namche Bazaar on October 18th. I reached Kathmandu on October 29th. I delivered my report to the British consul, in which I stated that the expedition had been struck by a severe storm on the upper glacier, and that 8 members were missing and presumed dead. I did not mention the creature. I did not mention Crowe. I did not mention the specimen jars or the Royal Dorian Society's true purpose. I told the truth about the storm because the storm was true, and I omitted everything else because I did not know how to tell it, and because I did not believe, at the time, that telling it would serve any purpose that the dead would have recognized as useful. The official record of the 1927 Khumbu Glacier expedition is held in the archives of the Royal Geographical Society in London, filed under reference HIM/1927/14, and it consists of a 3-page summary submitted by the British Consul's office in Kathmandu, dated March 12, 1928. I have read this document. It states, "The expedition, comprising 9 members under the leadership of Mr. G. Maitland, encountered severe weather conditions on the upper Khumbu Glacier in mid-October and was unable to complete its recovery objective. 8 members are listed as missing, presumed deceased due to exposure and crevasse fall. 1 member, Mr. T. Calder, government surveyor, returned to Kathmandu on October 29th in satisfactory physical condition." The document does not mention the Royal Dorian Society. It does not mention James Crowe. It does not mention a metal case or a gold locket or a creature on a ridge that held a man in the air and handed back a dead woman's photograph. The document is 3 pages long, and every sentence in it is technically accurate, and it contains nothing that is true. I did not find Eleanor Beaumont. I tried. I traveled to Surrey in the spring of 1929 and learned that she had moved to a nursing home in Hampshire. And when I traveled to Hampshire, I was told she was too unwell to receive visitors. And when I returned the following autumn, I was told she had died in February of 1934, and that her personal effects had been distributed to a nephew in London, whom I could not locate. I carried the locket. I carried it through my marriage and my career, and my retirement and my wife's death, and the long years in this house in Darjeeling, where I have sat with it in my breast pocket every day, warm from my body, holding the photograph of a woman I never met, whose husband's belongings were carried down a mountain by something I do not have a name for. And I could not give it to her, and I could not give it to anyone, because to give it is to explain it, and to explain it is to tell this story. And I was not ready to tell this story until you came. You asked about your grandfather. I have told you about your grandfather. Ang Dawa Sherpa was the bravest man I have met in 81 years of living. And I do not mean that he was brave, because he was not afraid. I believe he was afraid. I mean that he understood what was happening on that glacier before any of us. And he still walked forward and took the case from a hand that could have closed around him the way it closed around Maitland. And he said thank you to a thing that was 12 feet tall and not human, because he recognized that it had done a thing that deserved thanks. And then he walked back into the ice to finish the work, to return what did not belong to us. And I have not heard from him or Mingma since, and I do not know whether they are alive or dead. though I know which I believe and I know which I hope, and they are not the same. You told me, when you arrived this morning, that your grandfather's notebook was found in 2004 on a trail cairn at 15,200 feet on the Khumbu Glacier, wrapped in oilskin, placed upright on a flat stone. You told me the final entry was dated October 16th, 1927, and that it read, in your grandfather's handwriting, "Return the papers." The creature watched from the upper ice. It did not approach. Find the Englishman who carried the locket. His name is Calder. He will know what this means. I know what it means. It means Ang Dawa completed the delivery. It means the creature accepted the return. It means that on a glacier, where men came with rifles and specimen jars to take something that was not theirs, one man walked back to give something back. And the thing that lived there, the thing that had been trying for 11 months to return a dead man's case to anyone who would carry it down, watched him do it, and let him do it, and did not interfere. 9 men left Namche Bazaar. I told you that at the beginning. I told you I was the only one who came back down. And that was true. But it is not the whole truth, because the whole truth is that I was not the survivor. I was the recipient. The creature did not spare me. The creature was not interested in me. The creature wanted to hand something to a human being, and I was the human being who held out his hands, and everything that followed it, the storm, the deaths, the 54 years has been the weight of carrying what I received. I was not rescued. I was not permitted. I was posted, like a letter, like a parcel, like a case carried down a glacier and left on a cairn for the next man to pick up. The locket is here. I am passing it to you now, across this table, because your grandfather told you to find me, and you found me, and you are the next man. And the glacier is still there, and the creature is still there. And neither of them has ever asked for anything except that we carry what is ours and leave what is not. And I do not think in 54 years we have learned to do either. The locket is warm. It has always been warm.